In the blood-soaked amphitheatres of ancient Rome, where gladiators fought for glory and condemned criminals met their fate, there prowled a weapon that struck terror into the hearts of enemies across 3 continents. This weapon had no blade, no point, no metal forging. Instead, it possessed fangs that could crush bone, muscles that rippled with deadly precision, and loyalty so absolute that it would die before abandoning its master. Today, we uncover the forgotten story of Rome's most terrifying secret weapon, the Canis Pugnax, the war dog that helped forge an empire. Picture this. You're a Germanic warrior standing in the misty forests beyond the Rhine, watching through the trees as Roman legions approach. You've heard the stories of their discipline, their tactics, their unstoppable advance. But what you haven't prepared for is the shadow moving silently through the ranks. A creature bred not for companionship, but for war. This is no ordinary dog. This is a living instrument of conquest, trained to kill on command and programmed with one singular purpose: to serve the glory of Rome at any cost. Most people today think of dogs as beloved family pets, loyal companions who fetch sticks and guard our homes. But in the ancient world, these animals served a far more sinister purpose. The Romans, masters of warfare and engineering, understood that victory required more than just superior tactics and discipline. It demanded psychological warfare, terror, and weapons that could strike fear into the very souls of their enemies. The Canis Pugnax represented all of these elements rolled into one devastating package. The story begins not in Rome itself, but in the harsh mountain regions of ancient Greece, where a breed of massive dogs guarded flocks and protected settlements from wild predators. These were the Molosses, descendants of wolves that had been selectively bred for size, strength, and unwavering courage. Greek philosophers and poets wrote of these beasts with a mixture of admiration and terror, describing them as creatures capable of facing down lions without flinching. But it would take Roman ingenuity to transform these impressive guardians into something far more deadly. Roman military engineers approached dog breeding with the same methodical precision they applied to constructing roads, aqueducts, and siege engines. They studied the Molosses, analyzed their strengths and weaknesses, and began a systematic program of genetic manipulation that would make modern scientists envious. Through careful crossbreeding with local Italian breeds and captured war dogs from barbarian tribes, they created something entirely new: a canine weapon perfectly adapted for the battlefield. The physical specifications of the Canis Pugnax read like a military requisition form. Standing approximately 60 centimeters at the shoulder and weighing between 40 and 50 kilograms, these dogs possessed the perfect combination of size and agility. Their dark coats made them nearly invisible during night operations, while their deep, intimidating bark could be heard across a battlefield, striking fear into enemy ranks before the fighting even began. Their jaws were powerful enough to crush armor, their speed sufficient to outrun fleeing soldiers, and their endurance matched that of the legendary Roman legionaries themselves. But raw physical attributes were only the beginning. What truly distinguished the Canis Pugnax from ordinary dogs was the psychological conditioning that transformed them into disciplined soldiers. Where wild dogs attacked with chaotic ferocity, these animals learned to channel their aggression with surgical precision. They could differentiate between friend and foe through scent alone, respond instantly to complex verbal commands, and maintain their position in formation even when surrounded by the chaos and carnage of battle. The training regimen for these war dogs rivaled that of human recruits. Young puppies were separated from their mothers and raised in military camps, where they learned to associate the sounds of marching feet, clashing weapons, and shouted commands with safety and comfort. They were taught to ignore distractions, resist the temptation to chase fleeing prey unless ordered, and most importantly, to view their human handlers not as masters, but as pack leaders whose commands were absolute and unquestionable. As these dogs matured, their education became increasingly sophisticated. They learned to recognize the distinctive scent markers that identified Roman soldiers, the leather of their armor, the oil used to maintain their weapons, even the specific herbs used in military rations. This olfactory training proved invaluable on battlefields where visibility was limited by smoke, dust, or darkness. A well-trained Canis Pugnax could distinguish between a Roman legionary and an enemy soldier from hundreds of meters away, even in the midst of a chaotic melee. The Romans also discovered that these dogs possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect fear and aggression in humans. Through generations of selective breeding and training, they developed an uncanny talent for identifying which enemy soldiers were most likely to break ranks and flee, allowing Roman commanders to focus their attacks on the weakest points in opposing formations. This psychological warfare proved devastatingly effective against tribal armies that relied on individual courage rather than disciplined tactics. Perhaps most remarkably, the Canis Pugnax learned to function as an integral part of Roman military logistics. These dogs could carry supplies across difficult terrain, serve as messengers between distant units, and even perform basic reconnaissance missions. They marched alongside the legions for distances of up to 35 kilometers per day, their endurance matching that of the soldiers they served. At night, they stood guard over military camps, their superior hearing and sense of smell providing early warning of approaching enemies long before human sentries could detect any threat. The integration of war dogs into Roman military doctrine represented a revolutionary advance in ancient warfare. While other civilizations had used dogs in battle, they typically deployed them as uncontrolled shock troops, fierce but unpredictable animals that attacked everything in their path. The Romans, with their characteristic attention to detail and systematic approach to problem solving, developed something far more sophisticated. A living weapon that combined the ferocity of a wild predator with the discipline of a trained soldier. Training facilities for these dogs were established throughout the empire, from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south. Each facility specialized in different aspects of canine warfare. Some focused on breeding and basic training, while others developed advanced techniques for specific combat roles. The most elite war dogs received specialized training for particular missions. Some learned to track specific individuals across vast distances, while others were taught to disable enemy cavalry by attacking the legs of horses with surgical precision. The psychological impact of these animals on Rome's enemies cannot be overstated. Barbarian warriors who could face Roman swords and spears with courage often broke ranks and fled when confronted by the silent, disciplined advance of war dogs. The knowledge that these creatures could track them through forests, across rivers, and into the deepest caves stripped away the confidence that tribal fighters drew from their knowledge of local terrain. But the true genius of the Canis Pugnax lay not in its individual capabilities, but in how it multiplied the effectiveness of Roman military units. A century of legionaries, accompanied by trained war dogs, could control territory that would otherwise require twice as many human soldiers. The dogs served as force multipliers, extending the reach and effectiveness of Roman arms far beyond what would have been possible through human effort alone. As we delve deeper into this forgotten chapter of military history, we'll discover how these remarkable animals participated in some of Rome's most famous campaigns, from Caesar's conquest of Gaul to the brutal wars along the Germanic frontier. We'll explore the specialized roles they played in siege warfare, their contribution to Rome's intelligence networks, and the profound bond that developed between these war dogs and the soldiers who fought alongside them. The story of the Canis Pugnax reveals a side of Roman civilization that historians have largely overlooked, a testament to the empire's ability to weaponize even the most unexpected resources in service of conquest and control. The transformation of Rome's war dogs from arena spectacles to battlefield weapons marked one of history's most calculated exercises in military innovation. But to understand how these creatures became instruments of empire, we must first witness their baptism by blood in the sand-covered floors of the Colosseum, where death was entertainment and survival meant nothing more than living to die another day. The amphitheatres of Rome had evolved far beyond simple gladiatorial combat by the 2nd century before Christ. What began as funeral rites honouring fallen nobles had mutated into elaborate theatres of cruelty, where exotic beasts from the furthest reaches of the known world were pitted against condemned criminals, captured slaves, and each other in contests designed to satisfy the bloodlust of Roman crowds. Into this hellish arena stepped the Canis Pugnax, no longer merely a guardian of flocks, but a trained killer whose purpose was to provide the most visceral form of entertainment imaginable. The preparation of these dogs for arena combat represented a deliberate corruption of their natural instincts. For days before each spectacle, they were kept in cramped, lightless cells beneath the amphitheatre, fed only enough to maintain their strength while their hunger gnawed at their bellies like a living thing. The scent of blood was deliberately introduced into their environment, mixed with the sounds of human screaming and the clash of weapons, conditioning them to associate these stimuli with the promise of food and the release of pent-up aggression. When the gates finally opened and these starving predators emerged into the blazing sunlight of the arena floor, they encountered scenes that would have challenged the imagination of the most creative torturer. Unarmed prisoners, chained to posts, or forced to run naked across the sand, provided easy prey for animals whose natural hunting instincts had been sharpened to a razor's edge through systematic abuse. The crowd's roar served as a catalyst, driving the dogs into frenzies of violence that left the arena floor soaked in blood and littered with torn flesh. Some war dogs achieved a form of celebrity status in these gruesome spectacles. Their names were chanted by crowds who had witnessed their kills, their fighting styles analysed by betting syndicates who wagered fortunes on the outcome of beast hunts. These canine gladiators developed reputations as surely as their human counterparts, with particular animals commanding premium prices from organisers who understood that familiar fighters drew larger audiences and generated more revenue from gambling operations. But even as Roman audiences cheered these displays of orchestrated savagery, military commanders were taking careful notes. The controlled aggression demonstrated in the arena, the ability of these dogs to function effectively under extreme stress, and their apparent immunity to the psychological pressures that broke human fighters suggested applications far beyond mere entertainment. What if these same animals could be directed against Rome's enemies on actual battlefields? What if their killing instincts could be channeled not for the amusement of crowds, but for the expansion of empire? The transition from arena to battlefield required a complete reconceptualization of how war dogs should be trained and deployed. Arena combat had taught the Romans valuable lessons about canine psychology under stress, but military applications demanded entirely different skill sets. Where arena dogs needed only to kill spectacularly, military war dogs required the discipline to kill strategically, the intelligence to distinguish between targets, and the loyalty to follow complex commands, even when their own survival was threatened. This evolution coincided with Rome's expanding conflicts along its northern and western frontiers, where traditional Mediterranean warfare encountered tactical innovations that challenged conventional military wisdom. Celtic warriors in Gaul employed fierce dogs as living weapons, launching them at Roman formations to disrupt shield walls and create openings for infantry attacks. Germanic tribes used similar tactics, sending packs of war dogs ahead of their main forces to spread panic among enemy ranks and identify weak points in defensive positions. The Romans, characteristically, responded to these challenges by adopting and improving upon enemy innovations. But their approach differed fundamentally from the chaotic deployment of tribal war dogs, where barbarian armies unleashed their animals with minimal control, relying on raw ferocity to achieve results. Roman military doctrine demanded precision, coordination, and tactical integration. The Canis Pugnax would not simply be released to attack whatever targets presented themselves. They would function as disciplined military units operating under direct command authority. The breeding programs that produced these military war dogs represented a massive investment of resources and expertise. Breeding facilities were established throughout the empire, each specializing in particular bloodlines and tactical applications. Dogs intended for night operations were bred for dark coats and silent movement, while those designated for open battlefield deployment were selected for size, endurance, and the ability to maintain formation under heavy combat conditions. Training centers developed standardized curricula that transformed young puppies into lethal military assets through systematic conditioning programs that would remain classified secrets for generations. The details of these programs, passed down through oral tradition among specialized trainers, covered everything from basic obedience to advanced tactical maneuvers. Dogs learned to respond to subtle hand signals from handlers who might be hundreds of meters away, to maintain absolute silence during reconnaissance missions, and to coordinate attacks with human soldiers in complex battlefield scenarios. The physical conditioning regimen for military war dogs rivaled that of human legionaries in its intensity and thoroughness. These animals were required to march vast distances while carrying equipment packs, to swim across rivers in full gear, and to navigate difficult terrain while maintaining formation discipline. Their diet was carefully regulated to maximize strength and endurance, with special rations provided during campaign seasons to ensure peak performance under combat conditions. Perhaps most remarkably, these dogs were trained to understand and respond to the complex tactical signals used by Roman military units. They learned to recognize the difference between advance and retreat commands, to maintain position during flanking maneuvers, and to coordinate their attacks with cavalry charges and infantry assaults. This level of tactical sophistication transformed them from simple attack animals into integral components of Rome's military machine. The psychological conditioning required to produce effective military war dogs involved techniques that pushed the boundaries of what modern animal behaviorists would consider ethical. Young dogs were exposed to controlled violence from an early age, taught to associate human suffering with positive reinforcement, and systematically desensitized to the sounds and smells of battle. The goal was to create animals that would advance steadily into enemy formations, even when surrounded by screaming wounded and the metallic stench of spilled blood. Training scenarios replicated battlefield conditions with disturbing accuracy. Mock villages were constructed and populated with human-shaped targets that bled realistic substitutes when attacked. The sounds of battle were recreated using drums, horns, and shouting voices, while smoke and artificial fog obscured visibility to simulate the confusion of actual combat. Dogs that showed hesitation or fear during these exercises were eliminated from the program, ensuring that only the most psychologically resilient animals advanced to active military service. The integration of war dogs into existing Roman military doctrine required significant modifications to establish tactical procedures. Infantry formations had to be adapted to accommodate the movement patterns of their canine companions, while cavalry units learned to coordinate their charges with simultaneous dog attacks designed to maximize psychological impact on enemy forces. Communication systems were expanded to include signals specifically designed for directing war dog operations, and supply trains were modified to carry the specialized equipment and provisions required to maintain these animal units in the field. The logistical challenges of maintaining war dog units during extended campaigns pushed Roman military engineering to new levels of innovation. Portable kennels were designed that could be quickly assembled and disassembled during marches, while veterinary equipment and medical supplies were developed specifically for treating combat injuries in dogs. Specialized handlers, trained in both military tactics and animal psychology, accompanied each unit to ensure optimal performance under battlefield conditions. As these remarkable animals prepared to leave the blood-soaked sands of the arena behind and take their place among the legions of Rome, they carried with them lessons learned through systematic brutality and careful observation. The empire had created something unprecedented in military history: a living weapon that combined the loyalty of a domestic animal with the killing instinct of a wild predator, guided by intelligence training that rivaled that of human soldiers. But their greatest tests lay ahead in the forests of Germania, the hills of Britannia, and the vast expanses of Dacia, where they would face enemies who had never encountered anything like them before. The first true test of the Canis Pugnax as a weapon of war came not in the grand theatres of Mediterranean conquest, but in the fog-shrouded forests beyond the Rhine, where Germanic tribes waited in ambush with their own four-legged allies. Here, in the shadows between the trees, two different philosophies of canine warfare would collide with devastating consequences that would echo through the corridors of military history for centuries to come. The Germanic approach to war dogs reflected their broader military philosophy: individual courage, personal loyalty, and the unleashing of primal fury without restraint or calculation. Their animals fought as extensions of their master's rage, attacking with blind ferocity that knew no tactical consideration beyond the immediate destruction of whatever stood before them. These dogs leaped over shields, tore at the legs of armored soldiers, and died protecting the bodies of fallen warriors with the same wild abandon that characterized their human companions. But when Roman legions crossed into Germanic territory, they brought with them something the tribal warriors had never encountered: disciplined canine soldiers that moved with the same methodical precision that characterized every aspect of Roman military doctrine. Where Germanic dogs attacked in chaotic waves, the Canis Pugnax advanced in formation. Where barbarian animals fought until exhaustion or death claimed them, Roman war dogs conserved their energy, striking with calculated precision at moments chosen by their handlers rather than dictated by instinct. The psychological impact of this disciplined approach proved devastating. Germanic warriors who had grown accustomed to facing wild, uncontrolled animal attacks found themselves confronting creatures that seemed to possess an almost supernatural intelligence. These Roman dogs didn't simply charge forward in blind fury. They flanked, they coordinated, they waited for optimal moments to strike. Most unnervingly, they seemed to understand human tactical movements, responding to battlefield developments with an awareness that suggested something far beyond mere animal intelligence. Contemporary accounts filtered through the propaganda needs of Roman military historians, describe encounters where Germanic warbands broke and fled, not from superior human forces, but from the silent, coordinated advance of war dog units that moved like shadows through the forest undergrowth. The knowledge that these creatures could track fleeing warriors across vast distances, through rivers and over mountains, stripped away the confidence that tribal fighters drew from their intimate knowledge of local terrain. In the mountains of Dacia, where King Decebalus marshaled his forces against Trajan's advancing legions, the war dogs faced their most challenging environment yet. The rocky terrain and dense forests that had protected Dacian warriors for generations became hunting grounds where Roman dogs demonstrated capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. These animals learned to navigate treacherous mountain paths in complete darkness, to maintain absolute silence during reconnaissance missions, and to coordinate complex ambush tactics that caught Dacian defenders completely off guard. The siege warfare that characterized much of the Dacian campaigns revealed another dimension of the Canis Pugnax's military utility. While human engineers constructed siege towers and battering rams, the war dogs served as living reconnaissance tools, slipping through enemy defenses to gather intelligence about fortification layouts, supply caches, and the morale of defending forces. Their ability to move undetected through areas that would be impossible for human scouts to penetrate provided Roman commanders with tactical advantages that often proved decisive in breaking enemy resistance. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these campaigns was the bond that developed between the war dogs and the legionaries who fought alongside them. Unlike the arena, where these animals had been tools of entertainment, on the battlefield they became brothers in arms, sharing the same dangers, the same hardships, and often the same fate. Veterans spoke of dogs that refused to abandon wounded soldiers, that stood guard over the bodies of fallen comrades, and that seemed to mourn their losses with an intensity that challenged contemporary understanding of animal emotions. The daily routine of campaign life forged these relationships through shared experience that transcended the traditional boundaries between human and animal. War dogs marched the same grueling distances as their human counterparts, endured the same brutal weather conditions, and subsisted on the same meager rations when supply lines were stretched thin. They stood watch during the long, cold nights when enemy attacks were most likely, their superior senses providing early warning that often meant the difference between life and death for entire military units. Medical records from Roman military hospitals reveal the extraordinary measures taken to preserve the lives of wounded war dogs. Field veterinarians developed surgical techniques specifically designed for treating combat injuries in animals, while specialized medications were compounded from herbs and minerals to speed recovery from battle wounds. The investment in veterinary care reflected not just the practical value of these animals as military assets, but the genuine affection that had developed between dogs and soldiers during their shared service. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of the Canis Pugnax extended far beyond simple reconnaissance. These dogs were trained to identify specific individuals through scent alone, allowing them to track enemy commanders across battlefields and provide Roman assassins with precise targeting information. They could detect hidden weapons caches, locate concealed enemy positions, and even identify which captured prisoners were likely to provide useful intelligence under interrogation. Communication between war dog units and their human commanders relied on a sophisticated system of signals that had been developed through years of experimentation and refinement. Hand gestures, whistle patterns, and even subtle changes in posture conveyed complex tactical instructions that the dogs learned to interpret and execute with remarkable precision. This silent communication proved invaluable during night operations, where verbal commands might alert enemy sentries to the presence of Roman forces. The breeding programs that maintained these military bloodlines represented one of the empire's most closely guarded secrets. Detailed records were kept of each dog's ancestry, performance characteristics, and breeding history, creating genetic databases that would not be matched in sophistication until the modern era. Selective breeding focused not just on physical attributes like size and strength, but on psychological traits like trainability, loyalty, and to function effectively under extreme stress. Training facilities throughout the empire specialized in different aspects of war dog development. Northern bases focused on animals suited for cold weather operations, while desert installations produced dogs capable of functioning effectively in extreme heat. Coastal facilities developed swimming techniques and amphibious assault tactics, while mountain bases concentrated on high-altitude operations and specialized climbing techniques that allowed dogs to navigate terrain that challenged even the most experienced human soldiers. The economic impact of maintaining these war dog programs was enormous. Feeding, housing, training, and equipping thousands of military animals required resources that strained even Rome's vast wealth. Specialized equipment had to be manufactured, from custom armor that protected vital organs without restricting movement to carrying harnesses that allowed dogs to transport military supplies across difficult terrain. Veterinary supplies, training materials, and transportation costs added additional layers of expense that made war dog units among the most costly military assets in the Roman arsenal. Yet the return on this investment proved substantial. Territories that might have required years to pacify through conventional military means were brought under Roman control in months when war dog units were deployed effectively. The psychological impact of these animals extended far beyond their immediate military utility, creating legends and fears that preceded Roman armies into new territories and often convinced enemy forces to surrender rather than face the terror of fighting against creatures that seemed to possess supernatural abilities. The cultural impact of the Canis Pugnax on Roman society itself was profound and lasting. These dogs became symbols of military prowess, featured in artwork, literature, and public monuments that celebrated the empire's military achievements. Wealthy Romans began keeping descendants of military bloodlines as status symbols, while retired veterans often maintained lifelong relationships with dogs that had served alongside them during their military careers. But as the empire evolved and warfare changed, the role of the war dog began to shift as well. New technologies, changing tactics, and different types of conflicts would challenge the relevance of these living weapons, forcing military planners to reconsider how best to deploy assets that had once seemed indispensable to Roman military success. The legacy of these remarkable animals would extend far beyond the collapse of the empire that created them, influencing military doctrine, breeding practices, and human-animal relationships in ways that continue to resonate today. The decline of the Canis Pugnax began not with a single catastrophic defeat, but through the slow erosion of relevance that claims all military innovations when the world shifts beneath their feet. As Rome's borders stabilized and the age of conquest gave way to an era of consolidation, the empire discovered that the very qualities that made these war dogs so effective against barbarian tribes proved less valuable in the new conflicts that would define the later imperial period. The changing nature of Roman warfare itself spelled doom for these living weapons. Where once Roman legions had faced tribal armies in open battle, the empire now confronted sophisticated enemies who had learned to counter Roman tactical advantages through defensive strategies that neutralized the psychological impact of war dog attacks. Fortified cities, professional armies, and improved armor reduced the effectiveness of animals that had once struck terror into the hearts of Germanic warriors and British rebels. Economic pressures added another layer of challenge to maintaining these expensive military assets. The cost of breeding, training, and deploying war dog units had always been substantial, but during periods of financial strain, military planners began questioning whether the resources invested in canine soldiers might be better allocated to human troops or siege equipment. A single war dog required the same daily food ration as 2 legionaries, while providing capabilities that increasingly seemed redundant as Roman military doctrine evolved. The rise of Christianity within the empire created additional complications for war dog programs. Early Christian theologians struggled with the moral implications of deliberately breeding animals for the purpose of killing human beings, even enemy soldiers. While these theological debates never resulted in official prohibitions, they contributed to a cultural shift that gradually reduced enthusiasm for military practices that seemed to celebrate violence for its own sake. Perhaps most significantly, the barbarian invasions that would eventually overwhelm the Western Roman Empire brought new tactical challenges that exposed the limitations of traditional war dog deployment. When Visigothic and Vandal armies invaded Roman territory, they brought with them their own war dogs, an intimate knowledge of how to counter the tactics that had once given Roman forces such decisive advantages. The psychological warfare that had proven so effective against unfamiliar enemies lost much of its impact when facing opponents who understood exactly what they were confronting. The administrative complexity of maintaining war dog programs across a vast empire also contributed to their gradual decline. As Roman bureaucracy became increasingly centralized and standardized, the specialized knowledge required to breed, train, and deploy these animals effectively became concentrated in fewer hands. When key personnel died, retired, or were transferred to other duties, entire programs sometimes collapsed due to lack of institutional memory about techniques that had been passed down through oral tradition for generations. Regional variations in war dog breeding and training that had once represented adaptive responses to local conditions now became sources of inefficiency and confusion. Dogs trained in Britain proved less effective in desert campaigns, while animals bred for mountain warfare struggled in the swamps of Germania. The empire's attempts to standardize war dog programs often resulted in animals that were adequate for general purposes but exceptional at none, reducing their overall military value. The logistical challenges of maintaining these units during the increasingly frequent civil wars that plagued the later empire proved insurmountable. War dogs required specialized care, specific types of food, and experienced handlers who understood their unique needs. During periods of rapid military mobilization and constant campaigning, these requirements often proved impossible to meet, resulting in the gradual attrition of war dog units through neglect rather than combat losses. Archaeological evidence suggests that some war dog bloodlines survived the collapse of their military programs by transitioning to civilian roles. Wealthy Roman families adopted retired military animals as guard dogs for their estates, while some breeding lines were maintained by former soldiers who had developed personal attachments to their canine comrades. These civilian populations preserved genetic material that would later contribute to the development of mastiff breeds that still carry echoes of their ancient military heritage. The cultural memory of the Canis Pugnax proved more enduring than the animals themselves. Roman writers continued to reference these war dogs in literary works long after the last military units had been disbanded, transforming them from historical reality into mythological symbols of imperial power and military prowess. These literary references helped preserve knowledge about war dog tactics and capabilities that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Medieval chroniclers, writing centuries after the fall of Rome, often confused historical accounts of war dogs with legendary descriptions of mythical beasts, creating a body of literature that blended fact and fantasy in ways that modern historians still struggle to untangle. These confused accounts contributed to persistent myths about supernatural animals that served ancient armies, myths that influenced medieval military thinking about the potential uses of war dogs in contemporary conflicts. The influence of Roman war dog programs extended far beyond the boundaries of the empire itself. Barbarian tribes that had encountered these animals in battle carried knowledge of their capabilities back to their homelands, where local breeding programs attempted to replicate Roman success with varying degrees of effectiveness. These efforts rarely achieved the sophisticated results of Roman military breeding programs, but they established traditions of military dog use that persisted in various forms throughout the medieval period. The specialized knowledge required to train war dogs for military service proved particularly vulnerable to historical disruption. Unlike weapon-making techniques or siege engineering, which could be preserved in written manuals, the subtle psychological manipulation required to transform domestic animals into disciplined soldiers relied heavily on hands-on experience and personal mentorship. When the social structures that supported these training programs collapsed, the knowledge disappeared with them. Modern attempts to reconstruct Roman war dog training methods face significant challenges due to gaps in the historical record. While contemporary accounts describe the impressive capabilities of these animals, they rarely provide detailed information about the specific techniques used to achieve such results. Archaeological evidence can reveal physical characteristics of ancient dog breeds, but it cannot capture the behavioral modifications that made these animals effective military weapons. The ethical implications of Roman war dog programs continue to generate debate among modern historians and animal behaviorists. While few question the effectiveness of these programs in achieving their military objectives, many contemporary observers struggle with the moral questions raised by the systematic conditioning of animals for the purpose of killing human beings. These debates reflect broader cultural changes in how human societies view the relationship between people and animals. The genetic legacy of the Canis Pugnax survives in modern dog breeds that trace their ancestry to Roman military bloodlines. Neapolitan Mastiffs, Cane Corsos, and other large working breeds retain physical characteristics that reflect their ancient military heritage, though the behavioral traits that made their ancestors effective soldiers have been largely bred out in favor of temperaments more suitable for civilian life. These modern descendants serve as living links to a forgotten chapter of military history. Recent advances in genetic analysis have provided new insights into the breeding programs that produced Roman war dogs. DNA samples from archaeological sites have revealed information about the geographic origins of breeding stock, the degree of genetic diversity maintained within military bloodlines, and the relationships between Roman war dogs and contemporary breeds from other parts of Europe and Asia. The story of the Canis Pugnax represents more than just a footnote in military history. These animals embodied Rome's systematic approach to conquest, its willingness to adapt and improve upon the innovations of its enemies, and its to transform even the most unlikely resources into instruments of imperial power. Their rise and fall paralleled that of the empire itself, reflecting broader changes in military technology, social values, and economic priorities that would reshape the ancient world. As we examine the scattered evidence that remains of these remarkable creatures, we glimpse a lost world where the boundaries between human and animal, civilization and savagery, loyalty and brutality were far more fluid than modern sensibilities might find comfortable. The Roman war dog served as both weapon and companion, killer and protector, reflecting the complex contradictions that lay at the heart of imperial Roman culture itself. The final chapter of the Canis Pugnax reveals itself not in the thunder of collapsing empires or the clash of barbarian invasions, but in something far more intimate and heartbreaking: the quiet dissolution of bonds forged in blood and tempered by shared suffering across the battlefields of 3 continents. As Rome's military machine ground to a halt and her legions dispersed into history, these living weapons found themselves abandoned by the very system that had created them, their purpose evaporating like morning mist over forgotten battlefields. Picture the scene: a grizzled veteran of the Germanic campaigns, his service complete after 25 years of faithful duty, walking the dusty roads toward his hometown with a scarred war dog padding silently beside him. This animal had saved his life more times than he could count, had stood watch through countless nights when death stalked the darkness beyond their campfires, had charged into enemy formations with the same unwavering courage that defined the legions themselves. Now both soldier and dog faced a world that no longer had need for their particular skills. Their shared experiences reduced to memories that civilians could never truly understand. The transformation of these military assets into civilian companions required adjustments that challenged both human and animal psychology. Dogs that had been conditioned to view strangers as potential threats struggled to adapt to peaceful village life, while veterans discovered that the intense bond forged through combat created relationships that transcended normal pet ownership. These were not simply animals, they were brothers in arms, whose loyalty had been purchased with shared hardship and sealed with enemy blood. Some retired war dogs never successfully made this transition. Their conditioning ran too deep, their instincts too finely tuned for violence, their psychological architecture too thoroughly militarized for civilian life. These animals remained dangerous even in retirement, requiring constant vigilance from owners who understood that beneath the graying muzzle and arthritic joints lurked reflexes that could activate without warning. Village records from across the former empire document incidents where retired war dogs attacked perceived threats with the same lethal efficiency they had once directed against Rome's enemies. The breeding programs that had sustained military bloodlines for centuries faced extinction through simple neglect. Without centralized coordination and systematic record-keeping, the genetic achievements that had produced the perfect military canine began unraveling within a single generation. Crossbreeding with local dogs diluted the specialized traits that had made the Canis Pugnax so effective, while the loss of training expertise meant that even purebred descendants lacked the behavioral modifications that had transformed their ancestors into disciplined soldiers. Wealthy Roman families who acquired retired military dogs as status symbols discovered that these animals required far more than ordinary pet care. The dietary requirements, exercise needs, and psychological stimulation necessary to maintain a war dog's health exceeded what most civilian households could provide. Many of these animals declined rapidly in captivity, their spirits broken by the absence of purpose and the loss of the military structure that had defined their existence. The specialized equipment developed for military war dog units became museum curiosities almost overnight. Custom armor designed to protect vital organs while allowing maximum mobility gathered dust in abandoned armories, while training devices created to simulate battlefield conditions rusted in forgotten storage facilities. The economic infrastructure that had supported these programs vanished as quickly as the military need that had justified their existence. The Canis Pugnax stands as one of history's most remarkable military innovations, a testament to Rome's ability to transform even the most unexpected resources into instruments of conquest. From the blood-soaked arenas where they first demonstrated their lethal capabilities to the fog-shrouded battlefields where they struck terror into barbarian hearts, these war dogs embodied the Empire's systematic approach to warfare and its relentless pursuit of tactical superiority. Their story reminds us that behind every great civilization lies not just human ambition, but the countless forgotten allies whose loyalty and sacrifice helped forge the world we know today.